Hello everyone and welcome to my review of the upcoming DCS channel map in its early access state. On your screen shortly, I'll be putting up a list of the items I'm going to be discussing in this video. I will also timestamp that list in the video description so that you can skip forward and back to the bits that are of interest to you. The video is going to be split into two main parts. The first part will probably be of most interest to the most people. I'm going to take a general look at the map and performance and where it is and what it is. Then in the second part, I'm going to go into a bit more critical detail. A lot of people might find that a bit too geeky and train spotting, so feel free not to watch the second half if that's not your bag. Here are the items then we're going to look at in part one. We'll take a look at the limits of the map and its coverage. Then I will take a look at the time period or the setting which this map appears to be in. There is an asterisk against that because that's relevant for the second part of the video. We will briefly look at the airfields that are included on the map, and then we are going to take a bit more look in detail at some of the locations, look at the modelling and the visuals. We'll also include a few locations that viewers to this channel have asked me to showcase. I will then be commenting generally on performance, however we'll probably be noting performance as we go along through part one. Then I'm going to move on to part two. This is the geeky section of the video. I'm going to call it the Historians and Geographers Corner. We're going to be taking a much more detailed look at the individual geographies and the historicity of the map. I will be much more critical in that section of the video, but I do intend to be constructive in my appraisals. Then at the very end of this video, I have a special tip, or let's say some unsolicited advice for Eagle Dynamics. They haven't asked me for my opinion, but I'm going to give it anyway with a wee suggestion, but that will come after I've finished discussing the product. That's a bit of a tack on from me. Let's get on with the core content and take a look at the map limits and its coverage. To the question of map limits, how big is the map and what area does it cover? That sounds like a very easy question to answer. All you need to do is open the map and have a look. However, the actual answer is not as simple as that. Here I have the map opened in the mission editor, and I have moved the map as far left and as far north, so as far west and north as I can possibly go, and this appears to be the very edge of the map in the mission editor. So I'm going to zoom in on this top left hand corner, and you can see here we're on the River Thames, well inside London. We've got the east and south of London here with the docks, and there is high detail, buildings and street layout, urban areas, railroads, roads, everything right up to this point here on the very edge of where the mission editor will allow me to scroll. If I then move to the right, however, just north of the Thames River mouth, there is a section of landscape here, which is just the outline of the landform. No detail whatsoever. The detail sort of just stops here. Now, it looks like this might be something they've just yet to fill in, but it's not entirely clear. If we then scroll to the east, the situation becomes even more complicated. We've got the city of Bruges here and Zeebrugge, the port on the coast, with the Dutch border right about here. Now this area has road layout, it has the bridges and whatnot around the city of Bruges and the rivers and canals. However, there's no actual detail here in terms of buildings, cities and industrial areas. However, this might also just be in process of being filled in. This little section here is relatively well detailed, and then as we go south and west, obviously towards Dunkirk, it is incredibly detailed, similar to what we saw in London. Scrolling down then to the southeastern corner, here we have quite a high level of detail. The town names appear to be missing, but everything else, infrastructure, forests, hedgerows, bridges and whatnot are all there right up to the edge, and in fact at this point it looks like they may even continue beyond what is visible in the mission editor. On the far left, the southwest, we've got French coastline, which is well detailed all the way down to the edge. And in fact, it feels like I could scroll even further there, although I'm starting to see some very squared off bits of topography here, which indicates that that probably is the very edge of what is detailed. And here we can see the city of Dieppe is in fact well inside the limits of the map, with towns like Abbeville and Amiens also showing. This creates a bit of a confusing picture about exactly where the map starts and finishes, and exactly where the detail starts and finishes. I think we have to take into account that some work is still being done on this map, so talking about limits is a little bit difficult. I've measured this map across, and using the measuring tool in the mission editor, it appears to be 220 kilometers north to south and 250 or 245 kilometers east to west. Now I'm going to jump into a mission, and we're going to show that there are just some slight variations when we look at the in-mission map. Here is the map when you're in the mission. Now you can see we can scroll out significantly further than we could when we were looking in the mission editor. And in this view, I've got that same point of London, and then there is sort of a half transition between full detail and almost no detail at all. We've got some topography that's a bit blocky, but it's fairly similar match to what we saw in the mission editor. And then you get little areas like this. This is completely outside of what we saw in the mission editor, which has a boundary, a hard boundary here, but there's just this little blob of detail right there. And then we scroll down into France. This is the similar limit. That's a hard limit on the scrolling of the map in mission. So that's the same as the mission editor. Over in the southeast, we've got a different situation again. So now we've got these bits of detail which extend out beyond what we could see in the mission editor, but we can see them from inside the mission. And then up in Belgium and the Dutch border, similar situation to what we saw in the mission editor. However, we've still got some other sections of coast which appear to have been modelled quite well into Holland. So the whole situation is not entirely clear. This is very similar to the other DCS maps like the Caucasus, like Normandy, is you kind of have these semi-hard borders where detail just peters out, and then you've got topography after that to varying limits depending on whether you go north, south, east or west. Another question which undoubtedly people are asking is, when is this map set? What period of World War II is this supposed to represent? Eagle Dynamics have included a few features here with which we can date the map. Well, at least we can try. As you'll see, the picture starts getting quite confusing. The most dateable feature here is the airfield at High Holden, just outside of Ashford. This airfield here was not constructed and became operational until April 1944. This is just prior to the invasion, and it was used to support the units who would later move on to the advanced landing grounds in France. Another data point which confirms the spring 1944 date is the presence of the large concrete strip at Manston. Prior to spring 1944, this was a grass strip, and the concrete strip was completed in spring of 1944. So on this side of the channel, we have two pretty strong data points pointing to an April 1944 date for this map. If only it was so simple. Now we move across to the French side of the map. Here the picture starts getting a little confusing. We'll start with Dunkirk. This airfield, Dunkirk Magic, was last operational in May of 1941. It's not clear exactly when the airfield infrastructure was removed, but the last unit apparently which operationally flew from here was Stabjagdgeschwader 51 in May 1941. But that's not to say the airfield didn't continue to exist. Saint-Omer is here. Now, the last operational unit here was the 10. Jagdgeschwader 54, and this unit left in April 1943. Later on, in April 44, the Allies conducted some reconnaissance, and they indicated that the airfield was being prepared for demolition. And then further reconnaissance in June of 44 indicated that mines had been detonated on the runway. So this runway was blown up in June 44, which is still after April. but it's starting to narrow the window within which this map exists. Moving on to Merville. The last operational unit from here was in August 43, and then the Allies conducted reconnaissance in February of 44, and they indicated from their reconnaissance that the airfield was unserviceable. At least the landing areas were. So this airfield had effectively been knocked out way back in summer 1943. Finally, we move south to Abbeville. Abbeville was last operated in December 1941 as an operational airfield. The runways were mined in February 44, and the rest of the airfield was trenched in May 44 to render it unusable. So we have a series of airfields here which really weren't operating after mid-1943, and in fact most of them and their infrastructure had been disabled or destroyed by the Germans in 1944 quite early to prevent the Allies from using them. That indicates that this side of the channel was really mid-early 1943, but we've got data points over here telling us that this map is spring 1944. What I'm trying to say is that this doesn't match up. This stuff shouldn't all exist in the condition it's in at the same time. I don't know how to resolve this problem, but currently I have to say this is an ahistorical map environment. Wow, okay Phil, I thought this video was going to be a little less detailed than that P47 one. And how about we stop looking at this 2D map view? Good idea. We're going to take a look at the 3D stuff now, focusing on the airfields. I'm just going to show you the airfields, where they are and what they look like. I don't want to comment on historical layouts. I'll let other people do that. On the British side, or the English side here, there are 5 airfields: Manston, Hawkinge, Lymm, High Holden and Detling. And on the French side of the channel, there is Abbeville, Merville, Calais, Saint-Omer and Dunkirk. Let's go to England first, and we'll start with Detling. Here before you is Detling, aka RAF Detling. As you can see, this field is presented with 3 concrete runways which are bound together by a series of concrete taxiways. There are some ancillary buildings in the middle of the field, and there's also a large number of trees which I don't think should be there. My understanding is that these fields should be clear of obstacles because aircraft were still using grass for takeoffs and landings. I'm not entirely sure whether that is going to apply to all fields, however. We can see at the back of the field from this angle, I've got some further buildings, some hangars and some dispersal areas. And there's also a nice series of hangars off to the side of the field over there against that forest near the village. Detling is located on sort of the north central part of the county of Kent, not too far from places like Sittingbourne and Maidstone. Now, this is Manston, the giant mid-1944 concrete strip there, and this is looking off to the east towards France and Pegwell Bay just over there. Quite a different layout indeed here. A very large section of structures off to the northern side of the main runway, and you can actually make out the old grass strips are also visibly marked on the left there on the northern side of the strip. This is quite well put together. This looks really nice, this. In the west here, we've got some more of the airfield's ancillary buildings, and that's a pretty clear approach path out to the east. Quite happily land large aircraft on the strip, and the reason it looks like it does is because it was largely used as an emergency landing strip for all those aircraft coming back from the continent with damage. This here, my friends, is Hawkinge. This is a big grass airfield located just south and slightly west of Dover, which you can actually see in the top right-hand corner of the screen. This is a big grass airfield. You can see the grass strips kind of marked out in the middle of the field there. Unfortunately, Eagle Dynamics appear to have left a tree again in the middle of the airfield. That definitely needs to be removed, guys. That is a significant hazard. We've got some really nice concrete blast-protected parking areas in the foreground, and another nice arrangement of buildings, living quarters, and hangars over here on the southwestern sort of south corner of the field. This field is up on a bit of a promontory, a bit of a high plateau. You can actually sometimes get airborne out of here in various games and then dip down into the valley straight away. Anyone who's flown IL-2 Cliffs of Dover is probably intimately familiar with this airfield in particular. This is Lim, another grass strip which is just down the road from Hawkinge and slightly inland. As you can see, big grass airfield with the old runways kind of marked out where aircraft have been landing. There is, interestingly, a large kind of mode or painted circle in the middle which says Lim. And note the spelling is quite weird. It is pronounced Lim, not Limpney or Limepy or any other concoction that people like to come up for this place. It's called Lim. And here are the ancillary structures over here. Bit of a smaller field in terms of all the support stuff relative to the other ones we've seen, but this is a fine location down here on the Kent coast. And once again, a pretty good looking airfield. So, last of the bunch, this is High Halden, located just outside of Ashford. Two very large runways, kind of at right angles to each other, close to right angles, with a limited amount of infrastructure. That's because this field was built quite late in the war and only really was serviceable for a short amount of time. It was used by P-47 squadrons before they moved across to the advanced landing grounds. In France, panning with the mouse, sorry about that, it's a bit jerkier than the head tracking. Fewer trees in the middle of this one, which I appreciate. That's my current bugbear with some of the airfields in DCS, is the trees scattered everywhere. Sorry for harping on about it. Okay, those are the airfields on the English side of the map. Let's go look in France. Welcome to the airfield at Dunkirk. This is a bizarre little construction. We've got this large open grass area here with a very, very short concrete strip at the end, which looks like a C-172 might struggle to get into. This airfield is tiny. It's very similar to what I would expect from Wissant, which is not on the map. And not much in the way of buildings and infrastructure. It looks a little bit temporary, and I think I would only be using this in an absolute emergency. It's pretty small, and I can't imagine that tiny strip there is really useful for any of the DCS warbirds. This airfield here is Saint-Omer in France. This one, also similar to Dunkirk, has a pretty short concrete strip surrounded by a weird construction of taxiways and circles and what is probably a grass strip on the left-hand side there next to that structure. Very odd kind of makeshift, rather non-planned looking layout, but interesting nonetheless. And I get the feeling that these airfields have been based on real-world layouts because you just wouldn't kind of come up with this stuff on your own. It's really interesting. Here we have one of the large concrete strips at Merville-Calon in France. This airfield, which we'll see in a second from the air, is big. It has very long, wide concrete runways, suitable, I would say, for landing the medium bombers, and loads and loads of big circular parking areas for aircraft. Let's take a look from a bit higher up. Here we are then, panning out and above this airfield. You can see the large concrete structures and runways and taxiways, parking areas which go off in all directions. This is a big piece of infrastructure indeed, located quite far west on the channel map. Here is the field at Abbeville, the famous home of the Abbeville boys, Adolphe Galland's unit during and after the Battle of Britain. Those who remember looking at RAF Detling a short time ago will wonder, is this the same layout as Detling? Did Ego Dynamics do a copy and paste here? Compare and contrast. Let's now have a look around in some detail at the non-airfield parts of the map, and this is Dover. So here's Dover from above. This is a pretty highly requested location that people want to see. We've got the iconic cliffs up on the hillside. We've also got Dover Castle, and in the distance, the Chain Home radar site. Just panning down now to the port proper. It's pretty highly detailed, and you'll appreciate that more when I zoom in like this, right down into the port itself. From down at this level, we've got everything down to little fishing boats, we've got crates and whatnot, we've got people's back gardens, trees, little garden sheds. It is very, very highly detailed down at this level, and this level of detail is pretty consistent throughout the map, and we'll see this thinking or this design philosophy replicated in the towns and villages in other parts of the map. You can see here that the waves don't appear to be complete yet. We've just got the kind of rather pixelated vertical textures on the water, and we don't have the foamy waves which we see on other DCS maps. So I'm assuming that the foam or the waves as they crash onto the shores have yet to be completed. There isn't also a very big difference between the sea swell outside the harbours and inside the harbour. The seawall's effectively non-functional from that perspective. But to be honest, I don't expect a flight simulator to get the modelling of the maritime hydrography correct. This is the reverse angle from up on the hill. There is the castle underneath me, and over there you can see the chain home station a bit closer up. You'll notice as I'm panning around that it is quite stuttery, and this is going to come into play a bit later on when we talk about performance, but just note that. And I know people will sometimes complain when people have stuttery videos, but it's a little bit unavoidable. So there is going to be stutter as we look at this map 3D. Here below me, looking east into the sun, is the town of Canterbury. Unfortunately, Canterbury Cathedral does not appear to be here. But the rest of the town looks pretty good. You'll notice that they have done a sort of grid pattern for most of the urban areas which repeat. So they've got, I think the major roads and rail network are all based on mapping, but the urban areas are not exactly following historical layouts. And you see some of the streets just come to a complete stop and things like that. But once you're flying over this at about 300 miles per hour and a couple of thousand feet or more, you won't really notice that. Here is the port of Sheerness on the Isle of Sheppey, showing a few more of the industrial buildings, trees, concrete areas and quayside. This is quite a good shot for getting a feel for some of the industrial building modelling. You can actually see the structure on the left here. There's a floodlight above the door, which is floodlighting just the door and not the rest of the building. It's quite nice. Unfortunately, a lot of the buildings seem to have their lights on, even though it should be in blackout. So I'm a little bit disappointed by that. Here below me is Canary Wharf and the Isle of Dogs. You can see that this does not look like the modern financial Canary Wharf, which is covered in high-rise office towers. This is looking quite industrial and quite dated, which I appreciate. I'm going to zoom into some of these urban back gardens here, so I'm just going to quickly fly our way down. And this is something quite interesting to look at. Here we go, these row houses with their back gardens. Each back garden has got stuff in it, little garden sheds, crates, bits and pieces, flowers even in the grass. Someone's got a couple of shrubs in their back garden. That one's got hedges, and they're all slightly different on a repeating pattern, but that gives it quite a nice variation in look, just these subtle differences between each of the gardens. Quite a typical sort of row house look as we point off in that direction. And as you can see, when you get down to this kind of angle, the urban areas do look quite big, extended off into the distance. Here are the rail yards at Ramsgate. You can see the sidings coming in here from the main line, and the town of Ramsgate with its port just over there in the distance. It does look a little bit basic up front here, especially compared to the high levels of detail that went into the urban areas. But once again, from the air, most of that's not going to be noticeable. And these buildings do have quite a railway look about them. I dare not say what I think they're called because there are people that know all this sort of stuff about railways. Don't get railway people started on railways. This here is the little village of Wye, just outside of Ashford. Here you can get a bit of a feel for how these little small villages are put together. And we also get a nice view of the way the fields and the agricultural layout has been presented. These are the Kent Downs over here, these hills. They actually give you a pretty commanding view over southeast Kent and down to the coast. Here we're making a little trip across and underneath this steel railway bridge, just approaching the town of Rye, which is west of Dungeness. Very ancient little town which is perched up on top of this promontory. And once again, particularly with moving the track IR around, you start getting a bit of that stutter. I'm trying to make as smooth a movement as possible with my head, but it is just locking up with certain views. And here's some more of the railway infrastructure and some of those urban backyards which we saw up in East London. This here is one of the smaller chain home stations at Fourness, right on the northeastern coast of Kent. Here are the chain home towers from a slightly lower angle with some of the supporting buildings around them, and a view back down the cliffs towards Pegwell Bay and Dover way off in the distance. This here is the French town of Ouessant on the Pas-de-Calais coast. You can see the buildings have a different architecture to what we see across the channel, which is what you would expect. Right in the middle of the town here, looking towards just north of east. On the topic of performance, it is a bit stuttery and slow, just like we saw in the dense urban areas in England. Here we see some of the extreme detail that's been included down to the tablecloths on these cafe tables. And over here we've got some of the civilian vehicles and a military hospital van. Can almost read the numbers on these doors even. Very high level of detail. They've put wooden textures on the doors. This seems a bit excessive for a flight sim, but we've got to remember that combined arms does exist as well. So there's always the potential that someone's going to be driving around in a tank. And if this was really, really low detail, then I think it would be particularly ugly for the tankers. This is the French town of Granville, which still shows its ancient star fort layout. As we drop in a little bit closer to the town, you can see the urban architecture here and some of the surrounding French countryside. It looks just a little bit more Spartan than the Kent countryside, with fewer of those high trees between all the fields. So you tend to have a longer range of vision when you're down low than we're seeing in Kent. Here we are in the centre of Amiens, and we now have a cathedral to look at. This is the Amiens Cathedral. Interestingly, there appears to be a wheat field in front of it. That might be a leftover from the underlying agricultural textures before they started placing the houses on. Maybe that should be a market square or something. This is a wide shot of some of the French countryside in the southeast of the map. Got a forested river valley, a shallow valley here, and you can get an appreciation for the wider countryside. Notice the shadows just popping in and out. This occurs on Normandy map as well. It's just, I think, some of the way the shadows are modeled. It seems to be calculating the shadows depending on where the head of the viewer is, or where the camera is. So if the camera's at a certain angle, it thinks you shouldn't have shadows and it turns them off and on. It's quite frustrating. And it can make an otherwise beautiful scene look a bit rough once you start moving the camera around. This is the River Thames in East London, quite close to Canary Wharf and the Isle of Dogs. My main gripe with this is that the water is very blue and reflective of the sky. The Thames at this location, in fact, the Thames at all of the parts of it that are on this map, is very tidal, and it carries a lot of natural silts and sands which are suspended in it, which is why the Thames usually has this murky brown sandy colour. In fact, a lot of the rivers in Kent, except for the chalk streams, are like this, especially in the tidal areas. This water should be much more of a browny colour. It's natural coloration, it's natural sediment transport, but it just looks strange seeing the Thames constantly bright blue like this. It will reflect the sky even when it's a sunny day in its turbid condition, but I suspect this water is exactly the same as the seawater, so it's probably going to be bluer than it should be under all conditions. Now onto the topic of performance. This is where I notice some of the biggest performance hits. I'm going to bring up the little FPS counter. On the Normandy map, with the exact same settings I'm running here, and with the hardware I use, which is listed in the description to this video, I seldom get below 60 FPS. About 55 is the lowest I ever get. Here I'm experiencing 41 frames per second. And moving the mouse around is very difficult. We're below 40. That's panning very jerkily. Now over here, I'm now up to 60 frames per second, and then pointing up at the sky, my frame rate limiter is kicking in, so I'm getting more frames than I need. It's just when I'm close into these buildings, there, very sticky there. Here it's okay, I can pan quite quickly. It's a bit stuttery, but I can pan quite quickly. And here it becomes very sticky. It's just, I can hardly, in fact, pan at all. And there, once again, it's like walking through thick goo, trying to pan this camera around. If I now pull the camera out, I'm just going to tip the angle down and zoom out. We're already at my limiter, so it doesn't take much climb before I'm on my frame rate limiter and I'm okay. But panning around, there we go, we're down at 40, 38, 36 frames per second, pointing at the buildings. We'll bring the camera up. 40 frames still, 30, 40. Yeah, it's really struggling over these urban areas. And it's not till those LODs start moving down to the lower detail ones that I'm starting to get my frame rates back. I'm at 50 now, and I'm going to pan out faster. Now this is without a cockpit as well. There's no cockpit here, it's just map. I don't know if that makes it worse or better. It's not till I get up to about this altitude with the camera over London that I'm getting high frame rates. And here is the edge of the map transition as well, you can see. That's what it looks like when you reach the map limits. Looking down the Thames now, out towards the Isle of Sheppey, Chatham, Rochester. So that's a note on performance. I think this map is going to struggle on a lot of hardware. My hardware is pretty good. It's not cutting edge, but it's pretty decent. I get high frame rates on all the DCS maps, but this one is giving me some concerns. It's possibly still to go through some optimization. There certainly seems to be something with these building textures or building models which is making it run particularly hard over dense urban areas. One of the things I like to do when looking at maps in games, particularly those games that claim to have a historical base, is to see if the map builders from the game have relied on modern digital maps or whether they've managed to reference older maps from the time period. And one of the easiest ways to make this comparison is to see if the game developers have accidentally included modern developments in the map. What I've done here is I've moved the DCS map just west of Maidstone, and this is the town here where I'm circling the cursor near the top of West Malling. Immediately south of that village is this space here where the West Malling Airfield existed in 1940s. Looking at aerial photos, these are modern satellite images. You can see here, this is the town of Wateringbury, and up here is West Malling. And between the two is this very large urban development here called Kings Hill. And here is the Kings Hill golf course. This Kings Hill area is the exact location of the West Malling Airfield. It is now, in modern day, developed as a large housing estate. If we go back to the DCS map, you can see that there is no housing at that location. It is all empty farmland and forested area. Now there should actually be West Malling Airfield here. That's missing from the map that Eagle Dynamics have built. However, on the upside, they haven't included this large urban development, which has been there for about the last 15 years or so. So it does look to me, based on this individual data point, that they have not been simply relying on modern digital maps to get their map built. So just when I thought everything was looking pretty rosy, I stumbled across this. Now, this looks pretty innocuous. It looks like any old industrial complex. And that's right, it is an industrial complex, but the problem is with where this is located. Let's have a look at where it's located. That's it there. This view doesn't help us, but this view will help us. This site is located at Dungeness. And this is an industrial area just near the point of Dungeness. Now, unfortunately, this did not exist in the 1940s. This is actually the site of the Dungeness nuclear power station, and the word nuclear kind of gives you a little bit of a clue about when this area was developed for industry. Let me prove it to you. This is an ordnance map image from this location in the 1940s, and as you can see down here, there is no industrial complex. There is the Hope and Anchor Inn, but no industry at all down here. Over near the village of Dungeness, there's the railway station, the turning circle, and a signal station, but there's no large industrial development at this point. This is an aerial photo of the site in the 1960s. You can see that the nuclear power station and its ancillary structures have begun construction. And to the west of that, the rest of the site, which we see as industrial on the DCS map, is still undeveloped. Finally here I have the modern day Google map location, and you can see on this that we've got a much larger industrial site. This looks a lot more similar to what we see on the DCS map. Clicking on the satellite imagery there, you can see all of the industrial buildings quite spread to the west now, perhaps still not quite as big as the site is on the DCS map. But this set of images certainly indicates that the industrial site does not belong at this location in the 1940s. I now want to tackle one last topic which relates to historicity and geography, and that is the airfields which are available. I'm quite concerned about the airfields that are on the map, and I'm even more concerned about the airfields that are missing, which should be on the map. On the English side, there are a number of Royal Air Force, Royal Naval Air Service, and the joint USAAF RAF fields, which are missing. Just to name a couple, West Malling and Eastchurch are not there, and there are others besides. I would like to see Eagle Dynamics go through some of the widely available lists of airfields in 11 Group area and those built by the 2nd Tactical Air Force prior to the invasion, to get as many of them implemented as possible. On the French side, getting historical sources is a little bit more difficult. The airfields that we do have were largely inoperable by the time this map is supposed to be set. By April-May 1944, almost all of the Luftwaffe operations had been moved back 150 kilometers or more from the coast at this location. However, it's possible we could kind of fudge a few early 1944/late 1943 Luftwaffe fields in, but these are not those fields which are currently showing on the map. I don't want to get into the conversation about what should be there now. Dietrich from Storm of War, who I fly with regularly and engage in a number of DCS related activities, has done some research and posted on the Storm of War forums. He's provided what he believes is a set of Luftwaffe airfields which could be added to the map and which probably should be added to the map based on the extent that we have seen already. Unfortunately, there is not a single operational Luftwaffe airfield in this given map area after September 1944. So the map is actually completely unsuitable for either the Bf-109K4 or the Focke-Wulf 190 Dora, both of which became operational at about that time or later. And now a proposal for Eagle Dynamics. I recognize that having the team go through every part of this map to confirm whether or not something is historically sensible is a massive task, and I wouldn't expect anyone to really do that based on whatever digital mapping might be available to begin with. What I would suggest to Eagle Dynamics is once this map is released to the community, that you open up a specific bug reporting system where players can provide grid references with a properly formatted bug report, either identifying one, things that should be added to the map, which belong in 1943-44, two, things which should be removed from the map, which are currently there and don't belong there, or three, minor changes to features which are there but don't accurately reflect the 1943-44 period. I may be going out on a bit of a limb here, but I think we can probably leverage the Storm of War community to develop such a bug reporting system with a standard formatting. We could curate that for you and then submit those bug reports back to Eagle Dynamics in a standardized and simple manner. Chaps from ED, if that's of interest, please let me know. Let's work something out so that we can begin a round of bug fixing and improvements to this map while it's still in early access. Okay, thanks everyone for watching this video. I'm sure this stuff is going to be released to the playing community in short order, so get out there, get flying, enjoy the products, and I'll see you up there.